Good morning. I don't know if you were here last year, but I did the talk last year as well. This time I have some modifications. So Migrate hasn't gotten any old. It's still like rocking out there, and we're migrating more than ever. So this talk is mainly about getting you started with Drupal migrations. I don't know if you have used migrations. How many of you have used migrations before? Okay. And how many of you have done like custom plugins and hard stuff with migrations? Okay. So, now I have an idea. So first I'll just start with an introduction. So I think I missed a slide. Okay, so I'm from like Evolving Web. We are like a small Drupal shop based in Old Port, Montreal, and we are a team of around like 10 developers, 10 Drupal experts, and we do a lot of Drupal training, and we also do consultancy. We build sites, and yeah, so that's Evolving Web. And I'm a full stack developer at Evolving Web. It's been almost 2 years now I'm working there. And I've been doing PHP since 2008, and I've been doing Drupal since 2013, and I didn't, I tried PrestaShop once, but it didn't work for me. And I'm learning Python, Ruby. I'm a business administration graduate. I did like specialization in marketing. I ran my own web shop in India for 3 years, but then I decided to migrate, so I had to shut it down. I decided to migrate. Okay, immigrate, I mean. Okay, so I speak 6 languages, I'm learning 2 more, and I can solve the Rubik's Cube. I think that's good enough for an introduction. If you want to find me, just search for Jigar Caesar on Google and you'll find me. So, and these slides are here. The URL is not very pretty, but you can copy it if you want or take a picture. Okay, so these are some of the projects that we have done at Evolving Web, like U15. We have done something for Tourisme Québec, and Princeton University Press is supposed to be on the list, but I think I have the wrong slide. So CRN, Quebec Original. Okay, so let's take a look at what we are going to talk about. Firstly, we'll start with a brief introduction to migrations. But most of you have used migration, so I'll try to keep it short and focus on special cases of migrating translated content from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, which will make more sense. And we'll see how to migrate content which has been translated using content translation, and then we'll see entity translation, which is a bit difficult. So, and we'll also have a small chat about migrating other translatable entities to Drupal 8, be it your custom entities or be it other entities like users and taxonomy terms and things like that. Okay, so an introduction to migrations. So Migrate API basically, for those of you who haven't used migrations before, it's it helps you migrate data from a given source to a given destination. Say, for example, you have a list of CSV files containing chemistry elements like oxygen, hydrogen, and you want to create nodes from that in Drupal, like content, which you can go to a page of that particular thing and see it on your Drupal site. Then you use migrations. You tell it, I have the CSV, I want to create nodes with it, and it will create it. So you can do the same thing with other content types in Drupal, like taxonomy terms, users, and you can use a variety of sources. We'll talk about that. So before I knew migrations, I used to use custom solutions, namely the batch API, and I used to write code to read the CSV files and then migrate them, and I really used to love the progress bar with the batch API, so I used to do it that way in Drupal 7. But then I realized that it's been a couple of years I've been using Migrate. Before I didn't used to use it. So I realized that Migrate gives you so much functionality out of the box. So sometimes it may be tempting and easier to write your custom code, but I would suggest using Migrate wherever like you see any complexities. So if it's a complex migration, it's better to stick with Migrate. You can do a lot of things, like Migrate maintains a map of old records with the new records. So the CSV file has a particular row which will map to a Drupal content. And if the row disappears from the CSV, you can write some code to like get rid of the node in your Drupal, which is not out of the box, but you have to write custom code to achieve. But then you can roll back everything you migrated if something goes wrong, and then you can re-import. So those things are really helpful if you use the Migrate API instead of a homegrown solution. So then it provides a framework for us to write migrations in a standardized way so that we can focus on the data to be migrated instead of trying to like think about how we will map the IDs from the source to the destination and so on. So it makes life easier. It gives you a lot of things. You can just like, it gives you a cell phone. You can do calls. You don't have to invent the cell phone yourself. Okay, so some example usages, like I said, if you have data in CSV, JSON, or XML format, you can write migrations to map, like use those sources and bring the content into your Drupal site as taxonomy terms, as users and content. And though Drupal 5 is not mentioned very often these days, but you can migrate content from Drupal 5 to Drupal 8 as well, which is quite easy. And Drupal 6 to Drupal 8, Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, all are like doable. And Drupal 8 core comes with a migration module which allows you to do Drupal to Drupal migrations very easily. So we'll talk about that as well. And you can import data from other content management systems like WordPress or Joomla. If you are planning to switch to Drupal for getting all the to get all the Drupal goodness, you can use migrations to come migrations will welcome you to Drupal. And then you can, okay, that's my attempt to make a joke, but I'm not very good at jokes. So I'll just skip to the next slide. Migrations in Drupal 8. So, as I said, Migrate module is now a part of Drupal 8 core, which is a good thing. And there's some other modules which you need to use with Migrate to make things work. So like Migrate tools, which adds drush commands. I think there's a Migrate UI module as well, but I've never used it. Then there's a Migrate Plus module to which I have contributed on multiple locations. I added 4 plugins there. And okay, so in Drupal 7, how many of you have written migrations in Drupal 7? Okay, so in Drupal 7 we used to have to write PHP files and things to migrate things from sources, and it used to be a little complicated. But as in comparison to that, in Drupal 8, things have become really simple. So well, usually what I would do for migrating something, if a project involves migration, I would create a module called custom_migrate or something. And then I'll create a config/install directory inside the module. And I'll add all my migrations in the format like this one, migration_plus, migration dot, and then the ID of the migration.yaml. And I'll write my migrations in there. So when you install the module, the migrations get added to your config system in Drupal 8, and you can use it to then run your migrations, use it with Drush. So there's an alternate method of doing this. There are people who don't like to create modules for this, and they put their YAML files, they make the migration YAML files directly in the folder they are using for config sync. So for example, if your config directory is at sites/default/config, then you create the YAML files directly in there instead of having a custom module, and then you do drush cim config import, and the migration gets added to the Drupal config system. So I think the objective in Drupal 8 is to be able to create migrations from the admin interface, but I haven't tried it in a while because the last time I saw there were options to add field and things like that. So I haven't seen it much because I usually write them in YAML, but that might be possible. I haven't seen it in years. So Then the second thing is like we write YAML files to define the migrations, like I said, instead of creating PHP files, and YAML is all over Drupal 8. So you just create a specific file in a specific folder, and then the migration is created. You can also create migration groups to group your like relevant related migrations together, so that you can execute them with ease. And I haven't seen the Migrate UI module recently, but mostly in Drupal 8 we use drush commands to run the migrations. So these are some very handy commands that you might want to know, like if you want to use migrations. So the first one is drush ms, or migrate status, which shows you a status of all the migrations that you have, how many records imported, how many pending, and so on. And the second one is drush mi, which has now become drush mim, and which lets you like import a particular migration. And then there is drush mr, which is for migrate rollback. If you imported something and you just want to delete everything you imported, you do drush mr. And then there are like certain arguments which you can use with ms, mim, and mr, which are like -- group. You get to work with only a particular group of migrations, -- tag for using tagging with migrations, and -- all for executing all the migrations. And then there's this -- update argument, which works with mim, which lets you upsert records. So if something already exists in your Drupal site, which has already been migrated, it will be updated. And if something does not exist, then it will be imported. So that's a very useful thing if you're doing repeated migrations. So I'll just quickly go through this, how to define a migration part, which is quite easy. So for like each migration is a YAML file in your file system. So the first thing we do is, like I like to classify the YAML files in 3 or 4 parts. So the first one is about metadata for the migration, where we specify an ID for the migration, which we will be using in drush to do the migrates, like drush mim and then the migration ID to run it, like in this case it's program data. And then you can add a human readable label, like academic programs. You can add a small description. You can group the migrations together. So this is the group ID C11N, which is like the numeronym for customization, which I like to use a lot. And then you have migration tags, which you can use to tag your migrations. And dependencies. Dependencies is a very important thing here. You can make a particular migration run before the other one if they are like dependent. For example, you're importing a bunch of articles and you're importing a bunch of users. So articles will have a reference to the users because you need to figure out who the author of the article is. So in that case, we need to have the user data first so that we can refer to that user data and say, okay, I'm talking about this user after migrations. So in that case, the content migration depends on the user migration. So we can define such things with, we can define optional and required dependencies in the migration YAML file. And that's it for like most important metadata that we have. And the next part is source. So the thing which I really like about the Drupal 8 migrations is like everything is so nicely classified and clear in the YAML file. So the source area of the YAML file, the migration definition, deals with the source of the data. So you can use a bunch of plugins which come with the Migrate Plus module, or you can use Drupal 7 database to migrate, like bring in data from there. So that's what you mean by like the source plugin. In this case, I'm referring to a CSV plugin which comes from the Migrate source CSV module. And it takes a bunch of every source has its own custom arguments. So the CSV plugin requires a path to the CSV file. It requires the number of header rows you're expecting the CSV files to have, which in my case is 1. And then you tell it like the primary keys of the CSV file, like how do you identify uniquely each record in the CSV file, which in my case was easy because I had an ID column. So I tell it like ID is the column which identifies the rows uniquely. So please use that. And then we have fields. You can add like human readable labels, which make your life easier if you come back to the migration after a year and try to figure out what's going on. So you can just add a key value pair of like this column means this. And then you can use constants. Like there are many people who use the default value plugin, processing plugin, which works, but it's I've heard that it's better practice to use constants in your migration. So it works without doing a like plugin call, and it saves some like resources. So it's a good idea, like if you're using a fixed value in your migrations, use constants. And we'll see how to refer to the constants in the next page. So after you define the source, we're going to do some like massaging of the data, as they call it. From like we pick the data from the source, we do some things, and then we put it in the destination. So the process part of the migration definition deals with the massaging of the data. So here, for example, the first line that we see, title heading, is for stating that the title attribute of the node that I'm going to create, the content, is coming from the heading column in the CSV. And for the UID, I'm saying something similar, but I'm referring to the constant that I had defined in the bottom of this page here. So this is how you refer to constants, because all my author IDs are going to be the same for all the imports in this migration. Then you can do like multiple plugin calls. For example, for status, I'm using the callback plugin, which takes the data which is provided in the sort like published column, which is defined by source. So what I'm saying here is like take the data in this published column and send it to the callback plugin. And I'm telling the callback plugin that please call the str2lower function on whatever data was passed to you. And with the output of that thing, we see, we do like a key value mapping. So if the output of strlower is yes, then I want to make it 1 in Drupal 8, because Drupal expects 0, 1 value for publishing status of the node. So if it's yes, then I make it 1. If it's no, then I make it 0. So it's quite easy. There are a bunch of process plugins which you can look at. So this is just like scratching the surface, callback and static map. So like that, you can chain all plugin calls, and it makes your life easier. You have to write less code and call more plugins. And finally is the destination. Like you got the data, you massaged it, now where do you put it? You tell Drupal, I want to create entities, and in this case we are creating nodes, so it's entity :: node. And we are also telling it, like, if no node type is specified in my migrations, please make the node be a program node. So that's pretty much it. After this, you just install your module, or you re-import your config. Like if your module is already installed, there are people who reinstall their custom module to re-import their config. But the drush cim command has a source argument which you can use to import config from a particular directory. So the format is, I don't have it written here, but drush cim -- source equals, then you specify the path to the config files. And then you can do one more thing called -- partial, which means that's not a complete set of configuration files. I just want them as an addition to whatever exists in the database. So you might want to look it up. If you do drush cim help, you can find it out. So then we re-import the YAML files into the drush Drupal configuration system, and you should be good to go. Like you can execute your migrations. So this is the basics of migrations. Now let's see how to do migraciones multilingües, which means multilingual migrations. So since we are in Quebec, we deal with a lot of multilingual sites, French and English being the most dominant languages here. So this makes complete sense to learn more about multi-lang migrations. So what's so different here? In Drupal 7, we had various methods of translating content, but in Drupal 8, they have integrated translations, the translation system into the core to a certain extent, to a great extent. So you just check like 4 modules in the module list, and you're good to go with like a multilingual site, which is very nice. In Drupal 7, it used to be very painful. So, so that said, how translations, like when we deal with migrating content which has multilingual aspects to them, the first thing we do is we migrate the content in the base language. For example, your content is first created in a particular language and then it's translated to some other language. For example, if you're learning a new language, you have a base language which you relate everything to. So if you learn like a statue, you would say like, okay, what does that word mean? It's status in English. Okay. Then you learn it in some other language, estado. You say, okay, it's status again. So you have a base language in your brain as well. So Drupal does the same thing. You have a base language, so you migrate the base content first, which I refer to as non-translations sometimes in the presentation. And after you have them, you actually migrate the translations and relate them to the base language. So at this stage, like when migrating the translations, we ignore the base data, we just concentrate on the translations. So say you have the English data already, you will forget the English data now, you will only migrate the French data. So you relate it to the existing English data. So those are this is the main thing you need to remember. Apart from that, everything is easy. So let's see. Like I mentioned twice, in Drupal 7 we had 2 ways of translating content. Content translation, which was a part of the core, and entity translation, which was like a contrib module. Entity translation way is the default way in Drupal 8, and it's a part of the core. So now let's see the differences like between migrating content which has been translated with each of these methods. So first we go the core way, Drupal 7 core way, content translation. So this is how I translated some notes and took a nice screenshot to be able to show you how the content translation module works behind the scenes. So here, firstly, I created a node which got the ID of 20 with the title German Shepherd Dog. And it's in English, which is the base language for my Drupal 7 site in this case. And then I translated that node into French, which resulted in another node, like node 21. But if we see something called TNID, translation ID, which is translation node ID, I think, which means which node was translated in order to get this particular node. So it refers to 20, which means the English article. And same way, when I translated that to Spanish, I got node number 22, and it relates to the English article again, 20. So for each translation you add, you end up having one more node in the database, which is not very optimal. But that's how it used to work. So since Drupal 8.3, the Drupal core has support for this content translation translations to be migrated into Drupal 8. So all you have to do is write 2 migrations. So the first thing is migrating the base data, like I mentioned a while before. Everything is normal, except in the source plugin, you do not mention translations, or if you want to mention it, just mention it as translations false. This will tell Drupal that we are importing base data, base language data, and not translations. So it will only pull the data which came first. So it will get the English data in my example, the German Shepherd Dog. And in destination also, you don't want to mention translations, or if you do want to mention it for some reasons, mention it as false. So that will tell Drupal that we are migrating the base data and expecting it to create new nodes for every record, as opposed to creating translations for an existing node. Apart from that, everything remains same. You just make this base data migration, and then you move on to another migration. You write one more. I usually name them program base, you see the ID program underscore base and program underscore IETN or translations, whichever works for you. everything remains the same. But in this case, we have 3 changes. First, for the source, we tell translations equal true, which will tell the migration system that you are interested in translations and not the base data. So in this case, the base data will be ignored, and you will only pull the Spanish and French data from my example. You will not get German Shepherd Dog, but you will get the other 2. So you get translations true. The second thing you want to do is, in destinations, you want to mention translations true again, which means Drupal 8 which will tell Drupal 8 that it's not supposed to create like new nodes, but it's supposed to attach these translations to existing nodes which are already there in its database. So how do we tell Drupal 8 which node we are trying to translate? So for that, we write this part in the process plugin, like process area. So we specify an NID, which we don't do usually. So we specify a node ID, and we use the migration lookup plugin to refer to the node, like the base translation node that we imported in the previous migration. So what the migration lookup plugin does is it looks up the mapping of the keys of a different migration, which in this case is program base, and looks for the Drupal 8 ID of the thing which got imported with this, with a particular TNID. So that way, like, we tell Drupal 8, like, I want the translation to be attached to this particular node, and that's pretty much it. And okay, there's one more minor thing which I was missing, is like you always want to run the base translation migration, base data migration before the translations. So you want to mention a migration dependency on the base data. So this will make sure when you run all migrations, you won't be able to migrate the translation data before migrating the base data. So this will ensure you always get the base data first and then add the translations to it. So that like after you get these 2 migrations, you should be able to update your config and run migrations, and you will have all the translation data, unless you made some mistakes somewhere or unless your data is complicated. So the next thing we are going to look at is the entity translation way. So I have dealt with this like for a couple of times. So Drupal 8 core doesn't support this out of the box because there are certain like ongoing issues about this. I was trying to write a patch to get this working, but the patch was getting bigger, so I dropped the idea because somebody told me, like, if you write a very big patch, then chances are it will wait on the queue for a long time because nobody knows your name. And so I just thought, okay, why spend weekend time on this? I'll write some smaller patches. So anyway, so I'll discuss with you how I managed to like migrate entity translation data into Drupal 8 core, like a Drupal 8. So, like I said, not supported by Drupal 8 core. Migrations remain the same, like the format that I gave you. We write a base migration, then we write a translation migration. And the thing we need to do is like the d7_node plugin that comes with the Drupal 8, like a migrate_Drupal module. We need to override certain like aspects of it, like certain methods in there, because to make it support the entity translations. We are going to take a quick look at how this works. Okay, so this is how the table for like entity translations looks in Drupal 7. So as we saw like earlier, we were getting different nodes for different translations, but in entity translations, the node remains the same. We do the translations at the field level. So the entity translation module creates a big like table, which is like a registry of all the translations that are going on. Like, so in this case, I created node ID 1 first, which was like the German Shepherd Dog that I talked about. And the language is EN. And if you see, source is empty because there was no source language for this. I created it by typing it on the keyboard. And Then I created the Spanish translation for that. And here we see like the entity ID still remains 1, which is node ID 1. Revision ID is also the same. And the language has become ES, and we have something in the source which says EN, which means the Spanish translation was born thanks to the English version of the node. And same goes for the French translation, like the node ID is 1, the language is French, and the source is EN, because I translated the English node to get the French translation as well. So same goes for node ID 2, which I won't discuss. So this structure of the table, because of the changes in the data, things become a little difficult. So in order to consider these changes in the schema of the translation, we need to make some changes to the source plugin. And this is the counterpart of whatever I said in the previous slide. The previous slide is just a registry of all the entity translations that exist for node ID 1 and 2. And the actual data for the translation lives in the field table, and they are still related to node ID 1, as opposed to the previous example where all the translations had different node IDs. So we have a single node ID, in short. So what do we change? I first create a custom module where I would like to put where I will have to put my custom migration source plugin, and I'll base it off the D7 node source plugin, which comes with the Drupal migrate_Drupal module in the core. And I'll name it something big as this, D7 entity translation, and give it a meaningful description. So we'll override some methods here, I won't be going into the details of the code, but if you want to see the code, you can visit evolvingweb.ca/blog, where you can select a filter for migrate. I can give you that URL as well, but I don't think you'll remember it. So you go there, select the tag for migrates, and then you can see I've written a bunch of articles about migration. And so then we add this function here, which is handle translations. In the handle translations function, the method, I change certain things, I leave certain things the same at the top, and then I join the entity translation table to take it into consideration during my migrations, and I name it, alias it as et. I say et.type equals node, and I say et.entityID is node ID. So that's a good standard join. And then I want to make the main problem is the translations parameter that we were passing in the YAML files doesn't get supported out of the box when you're working with entity translations. So this is what I'm trying to achieve here. If the configuration says translations as true, or it is set, then if it's not empty, then I want the source to be, just a second. Translations is true, then the source column in the entity translation data will have some value because it will have a source node. So I just established that condition here, and depending on the configuration of the translations parameter, I just add a condition and set an operator whether equals empty or whether not equals empty. So that's how I make the translations parameter work. And then that solves one major problem, the translations parameter now starts working. But there's one more problem, since the base node always has the same language in this entity translation method, so Drupal always the Migrate API always ends up pulling the base version of the node for adding fields. You don't get the French and Spanish versions of the node ever. Even if you set translations equals true, you end up getting the base data in your migrations. So that's not very useful. So we want to load the source data in exactly the language that we are dealing with in this particular row. So we want, okay. So for that, we like modify the prepare row method, where we will add a consideration for the language parameter, and we will modify the get field values method. Like you can see all this code on GitHub. It's included in the blog that I just mentioned. So then you want to method the get field values method to add support for this language parameter, which does not exist out of the box. So once you do that, you'll start getting your fields in the right language. And the last problem that we will solve, which I missed by mistake, is this one. It's since the node ID remains the same in Drupal 7 throughout, like in Spanish, French, and English, we cannot uniquely identify a source node with the NID only. We need to have one more parameter to identify, like create a composite key of some sort. So here, by overriding this method, we add the language column of the source data as a unique identifier as well. So after overriding this method, I get the source IDs, which includes NID only, and I include the language column as a part of the composite key. So after this, every Drupal 7 node will be uniquely identified with an NID dash language like combination. So it will be, for example, 1-EN, 1-ES, 1-FR, which is unique. So that way we'll be able to refer to them individually in our migrations. And once you do this, you should be able to run your migrations, and it will like import your entity translations correctly. So for details, I'll just repeat once again. You can go to evolvingweb.ca/blog and find this particular article, and it has all the details along with a link to the GitHub repository, which gives you the entire plugin. You can just copy it and use it. I won't charge you. So then we'll take a quick look at, like, it will basically be a small repetition of the things we already learned. Migrating other entities like taxonomy terms, users, and custom entities. So basically, you want to choose the right source plugin. If you're migrating users, you choose the users plugin, and so on. The second thing is, like, if you're using entity translations in Drupal 7, then you might want to use, like, override the source plugin and to consider the entity translation thing that we just mentioned. And then always remember, import the base data first, ignore the translations, and then import the translations and ignore the base data. So, and lastly, make sure your base data is imported before the translations so that things work correctly. So, if you want to learn more on migrations, you can go to evolvingweb.ca/tags/migrate, and here are some more resources. You have the URL to the slides as well, which you can refer to again to see all these things. And I have articles on a variety of migration topics. I'm writing more, but I'm trying to spice it up a little, so I'm changing my topics, writing blogs about other things these days, not much Migrate. So you can see how to migrate data from XML, JSON, and CSV sources, then entity references, and more, mainly which is a very common question people ask me, is how to migrate files to Drupal 8, so it's there as well. I have a blog about it. And you might want to check out the Migrate Plus and Migrate Tools module, and please feel free to read the documentation, which is very nice on Drupal.org, and feel free to make corrections and contributions. And lastly, this is my favorite part, where I say, I can swim, but I can swim theoretically. I haven't tried it. So you cannot say you can migrate unless you try it out. So I tried swimming once, and I was underwater for 10 seconds, and I realized that theoretical swimming doesn't help much. So you might want to write some migrations, migrate some data to be able to say that you can migrate it. So give it a try, feel free. And merci beaucoup, thank you. You can find the slides once again on this URL. And I am Jigarius you can just Google my name. And we are Evolving Web. Visit our site for more Drupal stuff. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Do you have any questions? No questions? Okay, so I'll just, yeah?
If you have some content with same ID, how do you manage to get rid of that? Like you have some content with ID1, and you're importing content with ID1 again. So basically my migration failed in that case, right?
Okay, so yeah, it will fail, but you're saying the ID1 already exists. So which means, where are you saying the ID1 is in the source data or in the destination data?
In the source one.
In the source one. So I think there shouldn't be a problem unless you are migrating the node ID. Make sure you're not migrating the node ID. So remove the NID part from your migration file.
You mean the key?
Yeah, no, the key has to be there, but in the process area of your migration file, make sure you don't have any mention to NID.
Okay.
You are not supposed to assign an NID. So that should make it work.
Like when it will get imported,
it will create a new ID in Drupal 8.
Okay.
And if you ever want to refer to the new ID, you can use the Migrate lookup plugin, which is...
if there is a migration dependency.
Yeah, so you can use Migrate lookup plugin to read the destination thing from there.
Okay.
Okay, so I have one more slide which I really like to share. So some life-saving tips for developers, which is very important. Make sure you do exercise, don't just sit on the chair. I've had like a 27-year-old colleague of mine, ex-colleague of mine, who died of a heart attack. So make sure we get enough exercises and do things, because the doctor told him you're just sitting around, you're not doing any exercise. So now it's too late. And then make sure you stretch your arms and fingers so that you don't get carpal tunnel syndrome, which is very common. Like me being in this development thing for over 10 years, I have symptoms and I have started exercising, so I thought I'll share with you this important thing which nobody told me. And use proper equipment to make sure your eyes are relaxed, use anti-glare glasses and make sure your screen is right in front of you so that you don't get a neck ache, which I do. And ensure a good posture again. And most importantly, don't live to code, but code to live.
Thank you.
Okay. So thanks to you for being here.